You are listening to the fourth broadcast of TBR Radio Presents, TBR History Hour. Hosted by Dr. Edward DeVries, TBR Contributing Editor. The TBR History Hour is a weekly audio journal of politically incorrect history. In today's broadcast, Dr. Ed interviews TBR's executive editor Paul Angel. Ed and Paul pick up where they left off last week, finishing their discussion of the January-February issue of the Barnes Review magazine.
Last week, you'll remember that we were discussing the January-February issue of the Barnes Review magazine with our executive editor, Paul Angel, and we only got about halfway through the magazine. That's been the way it's been rolling, if you will, for the last several times that I've discussed the magazine with Paul. And once again, that was the case this time. There's just so much good material in every episode and every issue of the Barnes Review magazine that we just can't put it all out there for you in a single episode of the radio show. It's just too much to talk about in a single hour. And so, once again, this week, Paul Angel is our guest, and he and I will continue the conversation that we did not have time to finish last week, and we'll be talking about the January-February issue of the Barnes Review magazine. If you're not already a subscriber to the Barnes Review, you need to become one, and hearing about the great content in the second half of that issue that we're going to talk about here for the remainder of the hour, no doubt it will inspire you to want to become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. And so what you'll want to do is you'll want to go to the TBR website, that is www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org, and you'll see how you could subscribe to the Barnes Review. And when you do, you'll be able to download a PDF of the January-February issue that we're discussing. That way you will not have to wait for it to come in the mail. With that said, let's go to our discussion with Paul Angel.
Story you wrote for us on someone, quite frankly, I'm not Baptist, I was an Episcopalian. I should have heard about this woman, and many of your listeners may know her, and that's Lottie Moon, right? Lottie Moon, the great Confederate spy and Christian missionary. And maybe you can, since you wrote the story, you can fill us in a little bit the life and why you admired this woman so much, and also possibly why she is either being A, ignored, or B, vilified by the very people that should be praising her.
Well, the Southern Baptist Convention back in 2015, basically launched an all-out war on all things Southern, all things Confederate. It really caused them to have to exhaustively attack all of their own founders, because to a man, everybody who signed the founding documents of the Southern Baptist Convention back in the 1850s ended up being a Confederate in the 1860s. And Lottie Moon, of course, was no exception to that. Although she wasn't one of the founders of the convention in the 1870s, she became one of its first missionaries, having spent 40 years in China. But before she went to China as a missionary, she was a spy for the Confederate government, and that was a job that she kind of got into, interestingly enough, because when she was a teenager, her family moved from Virginia to Ohio, and she went to school in Ohio, and she married a judge in Ohio, but the judge that she married was a Southern sympathizer. Couriers would often come through their home. At one point, they weren't able to get these documents. Basically, the couriers weren't able to move along, and Lottie was like, well, I was an actress, and I did a lot of acting when I was in college, and I think that I could slip through there. And sure enough, she did that, and she delivered the documents, and she got back safely, and the next thing you know, she's a courier for the Confederate government. Shortly thereafter, some Canadian Confederate sympathizers would help her with some fake passports and documents so that she could appear to be a British socialite who was traveling in the United States, and that enabled her to slip back and forth between the lines with no question. Because
let me ask you a question. Did she mimic a British accent?
I would assume that she did.
Pretty convincingly.
Yeah. And I mean, so much so that, like, at one time, she reportedly rode in the carriage with Abraham Lincoln, and he had no suspicion. On a few occasions, she met at social functions with Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of Defense under Lincoln, and he would entertain all of her questions because he thought she was just this ditzy British socialite.
Right.
And had no idea that she was actually asking him targeted questions and, getting specific information from him. The one time that Lottie did get captured identified, as a spy, and she was court-martialed and she was ordered to be executed, and she was turned over to the commanding general who was supposed to carry out her execution. And as divine providence would have it, that general was Ambrose Burnside. And when she was in college, Ambrose Burnside had courted her. He would cross over into Ohio from Indiana, and he would court her. They were engaged to be married, and she had actually left Burnside at the altar on their wedding day. The story goes that when the minister asked, do you take this man? She said, no, sirree, Bob, and ran out of the back door of the church. But all these years later, Burnside remembered her and basically put her under house arrest and told her she could come and go as she pleased as long as she reported to his headquarters every day for lunch. And she did that dutifully for about 2 weeks, and then she disappeared, never to be seen again. I'm guessing that's probably the way Burnside had intended for it to happen all along. A very interesting story. And of course, Lottie, when she became a missionary to China over 40 years, had to endure 3 brutal wars and horrible famine. And I think the reason she was able to do that when all the other missionaries were leaving and coming home was because of the things that she had endured during the war between the states. That was the crucible, if you will, that God used to prepare her for a life of hardship on the Chinese mission field.
Now, recently, and this surprised me, that even the Chinese Communist government has recognized her for her efforts as a Christian missionary.
There was a memorial, a monument that was erected to Lottie, in I can't remember when, like maybe the 1930s. I would have to look back at my own notes, but it was before World War II. There was a monument that was erected to Lottie, and that monument was still standing, and for some reason it had survived all of the purges of the communists through the years. And I guess it came to their attention somehow, hey, here's this Christian memorial, this big obelisk, if you will, that we never destroyed. After a lot of debate, the Chinese decided that, hey, you know what? Let's make it a protected site. And so, it's actually become a recognized monument, and it's protected by Chinese law now that it can't be destroyed or vandalized or altered. And so
I say good for them.
Yeah. And I don't know, what their motivation for that is. Of course, the Chinese are always being accused of persecuting Christians and religious dissenters and so forth. And so, maybe this was nothing more than than something that they could show the rest of the world. Hey, we're not persecuting Christians. Look, we're protecting this monument to this world-renowned missionary.
Possibly. I understand that one of the largest Christian communities in the world outside the United States is in China still.
Yeah.
They could not crush that faith, as they could not crush it in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but the result is the same regardless of their motivation, whether it's a good motivation or a bad motivation. And who knows? Maybe Christians are making headway in China, and maybe that's the government's way of trying to further improve those relations. So, but whether their motivation is good or bad, the result is the same. The monument is preserved and protected.
I like what Lottie said at the end here. Her letter of October 3, 1887 to the Southern Baptist Women's Missionary Union founder, Annie Armstrong. A part of what she said was, I pray that no missionary will ever be as lonely as I've been. I'm working alone in a city of many thousand inhabitants, with numberless villages clustered around or stretching away in the illuminate distance. Why are the laborers so few? Please say to the missionaries, if the joy of the Lord be their strength, the blessedness of the work will more than compensate for its hardship. So I mention that simply because people don't really understand what China was like at the time. Even today, millions still live in caves. Now, they're quite advanced, but there's just so many people there. And at this time, with the famine, with the wars, if anybody ever wants to know what life was really like, read the book by Ralph Townsend. He was a diplomat to China in the 1900s, early time, called Ways That Are Dark, Truth About China. I mean, the tortures that their governments would put them through, the starvation, the suffering, the homelessness. We have been, the United States being we, has practically been responsible for giving these people the opportunity to live better lives through our trade deals with them. But you will never really understand what the Chinese people were really like until you read the unexpurgated comments of someone who came from a Western nation and went to live there. It was atrocious, the disrespect for life that they've had for so long and how they're so used to living under totalitarian regimes. But anyway, Lottie Moon, quite a gal, and you'll find her online, and many people concentrate on her cookbooks. Evidently, she was introducing Western treats to the Chinese, and we have a picture here they'll find this post, and I'm going to repost this because I did change the photo, of Lottie serving her famous tea cakes to a bunch of Chinese women who look extremely interested in eating those cookies. Let me tell you, they look pretty hungry. But Lottie Moon, quite a gal. Everybody should know about this one. But again, you're not going to, as you pointed out, for the simple reason that she was on the quote-unquote wrong side of the war between the states, and ergo must be evil, must have supported slavery or something. I don't see a single word about her family owning too many slaves or mistreating slaves or trading in slaves and all this stuff. I don't know what her family background was. Maybe you can fill us in on that.
Well, her father owned a tobacco plantation in Virginia, so there's a possibility that they did own slaves. But at that time, she was a young girl, and can you hold a prepubescent girl responsible for the actions of her family?
Absolutely. Well, sure we can. Today we can. That's part of our fake narrative. And again, I know after that, somewhat in the same period of time, of course, Tom Goodrich has written us another story here. I love this guy. One of the best writers I've ever seen as far as history goes. And he kind of told us a little bit about Boston Corbett. We've touched on old Boston Corbett in the past. He was made his fame as the assassin of the assassin. He was the man who shot through the barn, allegedly shot Booth at the Garrett farm here in Virginia. And he became an American hero. And here's just another thing, as my friend Mike Piper used to say before his untimely death a few years back, that the news media can make you a hero if they want you to be a hero. You can be a villain if you want to be a villain. And here's this Boston Corbett who became really, at the time, lauded as an American hero. He had speaking engagements people wanted to. He was pardoned multiple times for strange behavior in the military. And he was, as we say, mad as a hatter. Who knows? He actually was a hatter or worked in a hatter's place. And we do know that some of the chemicals they were using did make these people go crazy. I was surprised at the number of times that Corbett's religious zeal, because he was I would say a fanatic. You might get a job with Corbett. Perhaps you're working at the local grocery store, and if you cursed, he'd have to sit down, kneel down, and pray for your soul. Well, this didn't go too well with his employers on multiple occasions. I know at one point in time, right, he was when he shot Booth, he wasn't supposed to shoot Booth. There's still some debate as to whether he used a pistol or a carbine, but that being said, people were wanting to buy his weapons, and he refused to sell them because they didn't belong to him. So he was a moral fella, but he was brought before Stanton, right? And they said, you're the guy that shot Booth. And yes, I did. And I think I did the right thing. Well, you were ordered not to. And so he did the right thing, commanding officer, by bringing him in here. But you know what? He's done away with a trial, and he's gotten rid of a big enemy of the state. So we're all good with that. Of course, we now know years later that there's missing pages in the Booth diary, and that Stanton was running schemes behind Lincoln's back. And of course, one of the reasons Andrew Johnson was impeached, right, because he wanted to get rid of Stanton. Inevitably, I guess they passed a bill or something, prevented Stanton from changing prevented Andrew Johnson from changing his cabinet, and he ended up firing the guy anyway, and that's really why they wanted to impeach him. Of course, the real reason they wanted to impeach Johnson, I think, was because he was considered a Southerner. He's from Tennessee, if I remember correctly, and he wanted to impose a softer Reconstruction policy, and I think that's really why these Northerners wanted to get rid of Andrew Johnson at the time.
Well, as I understand it, there were 5 people that were supposed to be knocked off the night that Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson was one, Lincoln was one. There were 3 other cabinet members in the Lincoln administration.
Yeah.
And that Lincoln was the only one that actually took a bullet that night, but the goal was to take out 5 people in his administration, specifically to affect what would have been a major, policy change.
And since the war was over, and we also know now that there were multiple plots against Lincoln in both the North and the South, amongst bankers, among businessmen, among Southerners who wanted revenge, et cetera, that it's strange that there would have been a plot to wipe out the government, the U.S. government, after the war had already been concluded. There's always going to be guys you can promote into those positions. So there was obviously ulterior motives going on there. And today we know these types of conspiracies do occur, and who was really behind them and why they really wanted him out of office and who they wanted to kill. Seward, I understand, right? He had some neck surgery or something, and he had a big brace on his neck, so he survived. And I think the other guy chickened out, right? Which one of the assassins that was? I think he had a foreign name, maybe a German name, for going after Johnson.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Tom Goodrich has a bunch of good books. And one of them is The Darkest Dawn, which deals with the aftermath of the Lincoln assassination and the turmoil that was going on in the government and everything else, and the hunt for Booth and all this other stuff. Of course, the Barnes Review is published because we are willing to publish the researched points of view of many different people that are different from, say, the historical narrative, is that Booth survived, and there's good evidence to indicate that possibly he did. Lived a long life afterwards, that the man killed in the barn had the same initials. It was a Boyd, right, I think. And so we have a little book on that that's fascinating called The Great Escape of John Wilkes Booth. Even though Corbett became famous as the assassin of the assassin, right, he may not have really killed Booth there, but nobody knew the difference and nobody cared at the time. They just wanted to wrap up some loose ends and move on, I suppose. But yet again, a fast synopsis of a story that's much longer and more detailed about this fellow Corbett. I love stories about people we don't hear too much about, the inside story, little microcosms of history and how little small twists of fate. I mean, what might have happened if Booth had been captured alive? What might he have told us about Stanton? What might he have been able to fill us in on the missing pages of that diary? What might he have been able to tell us about anything? I'm not sure if he would have talked, if he would have ended up Epstein in prison, but Corbett certainly did not just the work of the U.S. government, but Stanton in particular, in wrapping up a very dangerous loose end. Of course, people were shocked that Booth was the killer anyway at the time. He was a rock star, right? And considered one of the most handsome men in America. Women would swoon over this guy. And he was well known. His family was well respected on both sides of the Atlantic. And so, yeah, always interesting to know what if Corbett hadn't shot Booth and they had been able to put him up. Of course, you wouldn't have heard anything much about it because they would have kept that all under wraps. But a fascinating little story. Lots of good quotes. And lots of very specific information about Corbett in that particular point in history from another point of view.
So the next article then was one that John Weir had submitted on Ernest Hemingway and Ezra Pound.
You know, Ezra Pound's always been one of our heroes. Extremely talented poet, writer, and his problem with what made him a thorn in the side of the American government was he took a different point of view, specifically on World War II, in that before World War II started and the rise of fascism, that fascism wasn't nearly as bad, that Germany, for instance, had rebuilt their country in such a short number of years, but specifically Pound had traveled to Italy and saw that there was an organization going on there. There wasn't what the news media in the United States was twisting what was going on, and that immediately put him on the wrong side. As a matter of fact, he was composing pro-fascist commentaries with Benito Mussolini's letterhead on it. You know, this is about 1940. He had moved to Italy in 1924, so he'd been there a while. He'd lived in London as foreign correspondent for quite a while, and he was under great demand as a editor. But he did become quite disillusioned with Western politics after he saw what happened in World War I. He's like, we shouldn't be involved in these foreign interventions. Foreign intervention is stupid. Let nations decide their own fates. Let people handle their own problems. Well, this is not the American way anymore. Anyway, starting with World War I, I believe we were probably messing around a little bit here and there, but with the extent that we did in World War I and the carnage of World War I and how our presence there just prolonged this. And of course, we're selling a great book too. I mentioned these products because we have so many good books about World War I called Prolonging the Agony. But anyway, what they did to Pound was unbelievable. And by the way, we'll get to Ernest Hemingway in a minute. But Pound ended up being, he was sent to the United States in like 1940s, after the war. In 1942, he was still saying things about the U.S. government. For instance, he said there was a force inside the United States that was not only trying to bust up the Monroe Doctrine, not only trying to betray our tradition of keeping out the European mess, but trying to start a war in order to get America into it, which is what we know, right? What we know about Roosevelt and Churchill and the warmongers around Roosevelt. So, but then Pound made another mistake. Besides countering or objecting to such a prominent personality, our war policy, he kept saying that the international Jewish bankers were controlling the democracies, and they were the ones who had pushed for World War II. So two books, both by Jerry Doherty and his co-author. One is called Prolonging the Agony, and the other one is The Secret Origins of World War II. And it's about how the banking industry and the bankers and powerful lobbyists in Washington, D.C. had really controlled the entire narrative. As you well know, what you put in the newspaper, you can brainwash the American public pretty quickly, especially in times of war. That being said, let's backtrack a little bit. We'll talk about what Pound happened after World War II in a moment. But little did we know that Pound was really a teacher of Hemingway. He taught Hemingway all kinds of things. He nurtured him. And Hemingway really admired him. He had done much for his career. But Hemingway was completely different. Hemingway wanted to be a war correspondent. He was the United States is right about everything. We should be over here. He covered the Spanish-American War for newspapers, but he was always, I think, marching around with the communists. Although his pro-communist proclivities may have been exaggerated a bit by some historians, he definitely wasn't taking the Franco side, the fascist side of the Spanish Civil War. And then in World War II, here's Hemingway showing up in GI garb, right, on the front lines, breaking certain convention of parts of the Geneva Convention, we'll say. And he ends up even admitting that he had threatened to get information. He wanted to get information out of a German prisoner. I don't know how Hemingway got in this position, but he ended up threatening the guy and telling him he was going to shoot him in the head. And the German says, you're not going to do brags about it. Hemingway was so proud of this. Boy, the next SS guy I was involved in interrogating gave up that information pretty quick. So he bragged about this. He's the exact opposite of Pound when it comes to war. And of course, Hemingway even admitted, he said he felt a little bit guilty about it, but he had shot a young German, non-soldier, 16-year-old, 15-year-old kid. Well, he was just going by on his bike, and he shot him and killed him. He thought to himself, well, I have a kid that age. Maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. Of course it wasn't. So Hemingway was a strange cat. In the end, he ended up committing suicide. So you couldn't have had two more of our quote-unquote literary geniuses have been more different. After World War II, man, in 1942, I think it was, or maybe it was 44, excuse me, 42, he was still writing propaganda or talking about American intervention and Jewish power. But they punished this guy. He couldn't be sane. The U.S. government didn't want anybody to think what Ezra Pound was saying was rational. So they basically said he was a nut. And at one point in time, they had locked him up in this outdoor cage in this military camp in Pisa. This was 1945. And he had been incarcerated without having been convicted. He was charged with treason for his criticism of the forces dragging the U.S. and its allies into the war with Germany. And of course, when they got him back over here, they slapped him in St. Elizabeth. St. Elizabeth, for those who don't know, it's still around, but not like it used to be, a mental asylum in Washington, D.C. He was put in that mental asylum for 10 years. And Hemingway, to his credit, gave Pound money, tried to get him a defense, tried to get him out of there. And finally, when they finally released Pound, Hemingway gave him money to relocate because he was destitute. Of course, Pound Pound's wife had stuck with Pound, I think, had a long-time mistress or whatever, but his wife, Dorothy Shakespeare, without the E on the end, was the daughter of an English novelist and born in England. And she supported him like until his death. He died in 1972, Ezra Pound. But basically, it was due to his accurate and critiques of the power of international Jewry as far as, their involvement in globalism and capitalism, and also Christian and other capitalist and globalist leaders. He was just persecuted beyond belief. Pound was our poet laureate, wasn't he?
Yes.
And here they're slapping our poet laureate in an outdoor cage, having people come by and spit on him. And so it just goes to show you. And I'm watching the news about what's going on with Trump and Iran and Iraq, and I have no opinion to say on this particular show about that. But just goes to show you how the news media, as I say, can make you a hero or an enemy, depending on how they like flip-flop them. Right now, the Democrats, if they had done the same thing and assassinated a foreign general, they'd be praising their president beyond belief, but because it's a Republican, they're not. At any rate, that's a very interesting story. I'd known a lot about both, but didn't realize the tie together and how much Pound had nurtured the career of Hemingway, and how Hemingway did his best to help Pound get out of jail. Even he was helpless to do much about it and pressure the government. Fascinating story. Of course, we have reproduced a few of Ezra Pound's poems here. Interesting stuff, the way he writes. I've got one here. I'll read it quickly. It's called Lament of the Frontier Guard. And he says, by the north gate, the wind blows full of sand, lonely from the beginning of time until now. Trees fall, the grass goes yellow with autumn. I climb the towers and towers to watch out the barbarous land. Desolate castle, the sky, the wide desert. There is no wall left to this village. Bones white with 1,000 frosts, high heaps covered with trees and grass. Who brought this to pass? Who has brought the flaming imperial anger? Who has brought the army with drums and with kettle drums? Barbarous kings! A gracious spring turned to blood-ravenous autumn. A turmoil of wars, men spread over the middle kingdom. 360,000 in sorrow, sorrow like rain. Sorrow to go and sorrow, sorrow returning. Desolate, desolate fields. And no children of warfare upon them, no longer the men for offense and defense. Ah, how shall you know the dreary sorrow at the north gate, where three Hoku's name forgotten, and we guardsmen fed to the tigers? I'm not exactly sure what that means. You have to read it several times, but it's anti-war, anti-death. The numbers of people dying, 360,000, the piles of bones, the blood-ravenous autumn. And so he's a brilliant poet. I mean, I can't remember anybody in all the poetry I've written writing like he writes. So there's a couple more poems I think people would be interested in. There's tons more online and in books that you should go read. And that he was punished for resisting America's belligerent war policy and for criticizing those who drive us to war. Sounds awfully familiar today. Sounded pretty familiar with what he was commenting upon in the Great Sedition trial, in which those who stood up and said the United States should not be sending off hundreds of thousands of men to be slaughtered for no apparent reason. And this was his crime. This was the crime of the people in the Great Sedition trial. This was Ezra Pound's crime. This is the crime of Geraldo Rivera. I say that. I was never much of a lover of Geraldo Rivera until I saw him last night commenting on United States involvement in the Middle East. He said that we should not be assassinating high-ranking Iranian generals. And by the way, he was on a diplomatic mission, for what I understand, this guy, Qasem Soleimani. And I don't know what's going on in Iran. I don't know whether or not they're really as repressive as they say. I can only say that the minute that Geraldo Rivera opened up his mouth and said that we should go with the original Trump doctrine, which is to pull out of the Mideast, and we shouldn't be there, the commentators around him began screaming at him. Several of them were Navy SEALs, and others had been in war. They've had friends die. They don't want to see these, quote unquote, sacrifices go for vain, quote. But they actually had the gall to call him unpatriotic, because he did not believe that we should be in a foreign country killing foreign people under anyone's behest. And it's same today. as it was then. If you stand up and criticize even someone with the long career of Geraldo Rivera,
I say, wasn't Geraldo a Marine?
he may have been. I don't know. I do not know. You can look that up quickly. I'm wrapping that up on our friends at Wikipedia. They'll tell us the truth. But it was shocking. The vehemence, the yelling, the screaming at this man who simply said, we can find better ways to help nations than kill people. And if they don't want it, my doctrine is this: if you want us there and you invite us there, we may consider coming. But if you don't want us there, by the way, in Iraq, isn't what our point was to install a democracy? And was that not democracy in action when their parliaments voted overwhelmingly to ask us to leave, that they don't want us in that country anymore? Yes, we know that things will change, that probably Iran and through the back door, maybe Russia will have more influence in that region. But my gosh, man, how long are we supposed to be there? How many more people have to die? Can't we give them a chance of peace and stability? Would another nation be able to do it better than us? We have two choices here: stay forever and things will probably never get better, or leave and give them a chance. To the Iraqi people, my gosh, how many years has it been since their country has been ravaged, since they just want their children to go to school, come home from school, practice at their places of worship, be able to get food, be able to have a heated home, be able to have a home that's not rubble, be able to make sure that their wife can go to work or to the mosque and not be shot or bombed or maimed or destroyed. It's unbelievable. So at some point in time, I think the United States has to admit, you would think 20 years would be long enough, wouldn't you? That $6 trillion, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of foreign lives might be time for us to think that maybe somebody could do a better job than we do, because I don't see things changing over there. That being said, I say that because what I've just said would label me a non-patriot, unpatriotic, un-American, not to support the idea that to affect positive change in this world, we must destroy nations to save them. And anyway, I think that's what Ezra Pound was basically saying throughout his whole life. He stuck by his guns, and he certainly wasn't insane.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it.
So, on the heels of what we just talked about you can make heroes and enemies, here we've got a woman I had never heard of. Her name is Dorothy Thompson. She was one of the most popular reporters of her era. She lived from 1893 to 1961. So she saw, at the peak of her career, mostly pre-World War II and World War II and post-World War II. She had weekly columns that she wrote for 20 years, I think, and twice a week, hundreds and hundreds. She was being read by thousands of people. She was married, by the way, to Sinclair Lewis, was her second husband. So she was married to another famous American writer. 1923, she married a Hungarian. That broke up. But anyway, she ended up marrying Sinclair Lewis. And by the way, they divorced too in 1942. She had the chance to interview Adolf Hitler before he assumed power and before I think he had been elected. She came across with the meeting with Hitler, putting her opinion out that this was just some little egomaniac. There was no way the German people were going to follow this guy. He had no confidence. He was self-doubting. And he wasn't much at all. There's no way it's going to happen. When he finally did take over, she was still there, and he had her kicked out. He did not like that critique of him. Turned out she was a bit wrong, but she was beloved for that. Here, look at Dorothy Thompson, greatest reporter in the world. Here she is slapping up this little anti-Semite Adolf Hitler. Well, after the war, she began to learn a few more things, and she found she was appalled by the treatment of the Allies to the incarcerated German soldiers, and also the expulsions of the Germans from the nations that were given parts of German territory after World War II. And she traveled to Palestine a little bit later, and she was appalled. That, by the way, that was 1945 when she went to Palestine. She had actually initially endorsed the concept of a Jewish national home, but once she got there, she saw how the Palestinians were being booted off their land. Their olive orchards were being chopped down. They were being abused and attacked. Their lands were being taken. And she basically said that it was basically what she criticized, what she said was Jewish terrorism. And this was extremely resented by powerful Zionist organizations immediately. Well, she didn't start writing about the 46, we'll say. 1947, the New York Post dropped her column. And so that was about 25% of her income. And then they started saying, and this surprised her, as if she was a pretty intelligent woman. She should have known it was coming. But the bitterest blow for Dorothy was the discovery that Zionists equated her criticism of their policies with anti-Semitism. Do we see a parallel today? That you can't go on a college campus, according to Trump's illegal executive order. Not only that, legislation that's been passed in South Carolina and Florida, that you can't criticize the actions of the state of Israel without being labeled an anti-Semite. She disputed this, and she says she was no anti-Semite. And she had a long record of benevolence to finding a homeland for the Jews, supporting Jewish refugees, but also she hated Hitler. But that didn't matter to them. The minute she criticized the state of Israel, she was persona non grata, and she lost all of her income. Nobody wanted to publish her stuff anymore. And by the 1950s, she was worn out and weary, and she wanted to kind of go back to a world where Christian values were what she had been used to. And so one of her friends said, politically, she was like a great ship.
I was going to say, but her work in the media for however many years had undermined those same Christian characteristics of society that she was so longing to go back to.
She was wrong. Okay. But she says politically she was like a great ship left stranded on the beach after the tide had gone out. I'm not sure whether or not that she was certainly a believer in foreign intervention as far as Adolf Hitler goes and the United States getting involved in crushing Hitler. Anyway, she wrote her last column in 1958. So she had a few people left. But she had written, she had an endurance record that's unbelievable. 1/3 of her life, 21 years, she had written this column called On the Record. It was 3 times a week for this one, 17 years for that, 50 weeks annually. And she had also written that long for Ladies' Home Journal. And she had been a correspondent for the Philadelphia Ledger. And I mean, it just goes to show you overnight, one little criticism of the behavior of the leaders of Israel, and she was out the door. Now she wanted to write her autobiography, right? And she ended up not being able to get it done. A few publishers were very interested in it. She died in Portugal. She never came back to the United States, I guess, to live, but she died in like 1961. At its peak in 1940, 7.5 million people were reading her stuff. So when you get that popular and when you get a following, they are watching you. It's like the FBI was watching Willis Carto very, very carefully in the 1970s and early 80s when he had 375,000 readers at its peak at the Spotlight. As I always say, 375,000. This is a massive, what is the percent? 1% of the U.S. population today. And so then it must have been a higher percentage. Anytime you're reaching that many people, they are very aware of what you're saying. Now, she did write in 1950, this was good. The Zionists would like us all to believe that there is no such thing as an Arab. They also have adopted the attitude that the state of Israel, unlike every other state on earth, is sacrosanct and outside any criticism whatsoever. This is the more irritating since the Jewish people as a whole have never been reticent in their criticisms of every other state and society on the globe. So have things changed? Not too much. They've only gotten worse since 1945, 46, 47. What's our lesson? You want to have a successful career in the media, you better say what you're told. That's a very interesting article. Once again, just a small précis of it. She ended up testifying before Congress. She was a bigwig until she made that one little mistake, and that was criticizing the uncriticizable. And we wrap up that issue, I believe, with a story on Joe McCarthy. Not like we haven't talked about Joe McCarthy before, but as every year passes, we find out more and more about the communist infiltration of the United States in World War II and those around in the post-World War II era, those around Franklin Roosevelt and even Harry Truman, how they smeared McCarthy. You got to watch out. You got to be aware when you're watching the news, when you're listening to Adam Schiff or Jerry Nadler, right? I think that's his name, is the other guy. Don't believe a word they're saying because they have an agenda, and their agenda is not only to get rid of Trump, but it's more or less because Trump is putting a kibosh on part of their plan to flood this country with illegal immigrants and others who will vote Democratic and keep them in power forever. So they can put in this policy and system where I believe that white people are diminished, they're guilt-ridden, they're disempowered, they're uneducated, they're not given any preferences as other minorities are these days, et cetera, which is basically we're their roadblock to the New World Order. I don't know if that's 100% true because liberal whites are jumping on the bandwagon. I should say radical leftist whites are jumping on the bandwagon. Say here in Virginia, I mentioned 95% of the counties have signed on to protect gun rights in counties to the point where we'll have our own militias and resist any type of National Guard intrusion into a county. But the people in Northern Virginia outside there are a completely different breed. That being said, along the way, what they did to McCarthy was they kind of made sure that this guy Cohn, Roy Cohn was his name, Roy Cohn. And Cohn was a big, annoying loudmouth. So they made sure he got on the news with McCarthy or the Army hearings or the communist hearings where Cohn was his most aggressive and annoying behavior was focused upon. Of course, we end up knowing that he was a homosexual and he was Jewish. And so at the time, McCarthy didn't really want to fire him for fear he'd be labeled an anti-Semite. So even McCarthy was scared. And of course, McCarthy endured the smears on his person, his reputation, his motivations, what he was trying to do. Was he a power mad, crazy man? Well, they did everything in their policy to smear this guy. It's funny. I got a picture of McCarthy here holding up a newspaper, and it says, "McCarthyism is treason to America." Of course, this was the headline of the Communist Party's Daily Worker. So the communists really weren't fans of him for pointing out just how far this country had been communized even then. Now, today it's gotten worse. We now know that, for instance, I got something the other day I think is legit, that George Soros was a member of the Antifa League in Germany when he was in Germany. I think they were also alleging that at one point in time he was an SS officer. I don't know if that's true or not. Someone will have to do some research and let me know. That being said, Same thing. If you look at what was happening in Weimar Germany and the communist uprisings in Germany, the communist uprisings years and years before in 1848, they had the same exact playbook, the same. We've talked about this before. And if you look at, I hate to say it, the Democrats, I don't like to be too partisan, but the Democratic Party today has adopted many of those planks. You know, they would like to atheize us. They would like to multiculturalize us. They would like us to disempower us, de-educate us, whatever else, have the progressive income tax, which they've got. Everything they're doing is exactly out of the communist playbook. Daggone shame that McCarthy couldn't finish his work. Of course, my author alleges at the very end of this article, it's not a conspiracy article at all, it's loaded with quotes from McCarthy and others from verified sources, but he is suspicious about the death of McCarthy. And we also understand, and it's kind of a tie together with Forrestal, James Forrestal, who was pushed out of a hospital window.
Patton died at Bethesda from complications from a broken arm. So
yeah, there you go. So what's that? They thought he thinks maybe he was terminated. He went in for something that was hepatitis or whatever he got there, and it's only he's only 48 years old, I think. He had a troublesome leg and had been injured in his wartime service. He was in the Air Force, I believe, or in reserve or something, and a plane crashed, broke his leg real bad. So he was supposed to having problems with this years and years later. He was 48 years old. He'd gone to the hospital, and the Bethesda Naval Hospital directors released nothing more than a little statement that said that McCarthy summed hepatitis of non-infectious type, acute, cause unknown. Now, this has a mortality rate of about 5% among people that old. Yet, boom, he was done, finished, out the door. So they had talked about recently how McCarthy's going to be gotten rid of the usual American way. The American public will vote him out of office. But that's not really the American way. The American way a lot of times is to take a little more aggressive stance and assassinate somebody that's in their way. So there are questions about his death. But contrary to popular belief, and as we look around this country right now, you better watch out and go back and look at what McCarthy had to say about what was going on at the time, because it's mirroring what is happening now. I think going back and taking a look at McCarthy is extremely important for this particular day and age.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
Was a letter you had written or a concern you had about, we have a history of may have missed section in which we kind of synopsize stuff. Maybe you haven't heard about an arrested revisionist or a find, an archaeological find, something they're trying to suppress. And it was one of my editor John Tiffany's on trying to counter some American legends as far as the war for Texas independence went. And you were pretty fired up about that. And you wrote me a letter saying we shouldn't be talking about Davy Crockett trying to escape in a disguise or being caught under a bed, hiding under a bed. And there's very good reasons for that. Or that Travis wasn't much of a military leader. Well, I got to tell you, I got a couple other letters about that. And so I will say we stick by the truth. But we have a lot of things to talk about. And I will say, I love to hear from my readers. My readers were a little bit irritated about that particular history you may have missed item, which brought into question some of our own legends. But again, we are in the business of correcting the historical record. If it turns out, then we don't want to jump on the bandwagon, obviously, because we're great admirers of Robert E. Lee. And if we found out that Robert E. Lee beat a slave one time, I'm not going to change my opinion about Robert E. Lee. Of course, he didn't do that. He was quite the opposite. But we will correct the historical record when it's proven. The thing about the Alamo, and I should have probably considered this a little more carefully, the thing about the Alamo was there was nobody there writing down the history of it. So who knows whether Crockett was found under a bed, whether he had PTSD, whether he was hiding because he was scared the bombardment was going to bring rocks down on his head. Okay, that was a mistake there. I do not believe, now you were saying legends are extremely possible in this. I've always said this, and my particular example of this is, and for the black community and black nationalists in general, if they're trying to instill pride in their people, if they want to say that they built the pyramids, I don't really care. We will correct that in our own historical record. Myth and legend are a particularly important part of our own past. But I think that these days, they're picking on our culture heroes enough that the Barnes Review doesn't have to jump on the bandwagon. We have a lot of other things to go across. So I was glad to hear from my readers. I'm glad to hear comments. Anybody who listens to the show should send me an email at paul@barnesreview.org. Paul@Barnes is BARNES review.org. And let me know what you think about these things. We're not real sensitive about this. I've been through enough in my life to understand that we must all be able to accept criticism. Otherwise, we don't make progress or we don't advance. So this is one of those few magazines where we will run scathing criticisms of us. I can't see any other magazine putting in what we put in our letter section. Our letter section alone might be worth the price of admission. By the way, we also had an error in that particular issue in which we misidentified a gun. It was Browning, and it should have been a Colt. It wasn't a Colt. I think we identified it as a Colt 1911, and it was really a Browning. But so we'll also correct when we are wrong. We'll run a correction. This is something else that the mainstream news media will not do, and you know this because of the story of the little black girl we mentioned that cut her pigtails off, but alleged it was racist white kids who did it. Okay, that was all over the internet, all over the news. And finally, it turned out that they found out and they admitted that the little black girl, who was just a little kid, did this to herself. Yet I never saw one correction of fact on any of the stations that had put this on in my area an hour a night for 5 or 6 or 7 straight nights. Then they find out that the fake news they've been putting out is fake news completely, top to bottom, been debunked, and they never run a correction. So we're pretty honest about that. And again, we will run your letters if you're a subscriber. If you're not a subscriber, you need to become a subscriber. But we are listening to people. Many of the things we put in this magazine are suggestions from readers. Reader input is important. This is your magazine, so to speak, in that if you want to hear about a particular subject, we'll do our best to look into it and run the best article we can, the most factual article we can, if we think it's of interest to the majority of our readers. So I am appreciative of critique. I will give one last example. I was trained as a graphic designer, and I had a teacher who was trying to desensitize people to criticism. And I think this is part of the reason I'm not really sensitive to it, is we had spent hours and hours and hours on these projects. They were done on illustration board. They were pen and ink drawings, we'll say. We probably, all the students in the class had spent a minimum of 20 hours on that. We all hung them up proudly. And he went to the first one and took his mat knife, which is a utility knife, we'll say, and he just took it and jammed it right into the guy's artwork and put a huge X in knife, tore it off the wall, and said, "This is terrible." Okay. He went to the next one and pulls it off the wall and rips it in half, and he went down the whole line. And the whole point was to desensitize people to criticism. After that, girls were crying, guys were like, "I hate this guy." I'm like, I get it. He's going to say from this point on, no one's ever going to criticize you like this again. It's no big deal. You listen to what he's saying, right or wrong. Criticism can be wrong. You take it, you listen to it, you respond to it one way or another. You either defend it or agree with it. So I will say that we're completely open. We'd love to hear from people. So please think about that. You can also write us a letter if you want to. And that's our TBR. It's the Barnes Review, and that's at P.O. Box 550, that is. P.O. Box 550 in White Plains, Maryland, 20695. That'll about wrap me up for this particular issue.
And Paul wrapped that up at a good time, because we are just about out of time for this week's episode of TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. If you are watching these episodes on YouTube, you've noticed that our show graphics have improved over the last couple weeks. From a production standpoint, of course, there's always some hiccuping, some mounting and remounting, some mismounting of the saddle, if you will, trying to get going. on a new show, and we've kind of been hiccuping through that, but we're there now. And so, awesome. And so just hoping that we'll be able to maintain that as we transition to our new studio. We've been doing all this moving between studios. And so it's just going to get better and better and better. And I'm excited about, the possibilities of this show. And it's just stay with us. It's going to be a great journey this year as we're going to be continuing this audio journey of politically incorrect history and thought. Go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, and you'll be able to see how you can subscribe to the Barnes Review. Also, when you go to the Barnes Review website, there's a bookstore there. There are some great materials there. You can also click the radio tab for TBR Radio at barnesreview.org. And when you click that radio tab, you'll see all of the back episodes of TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. Plus, you'll see all of last year, 2019, and the year before that, 2018's TBR radio shows. And so you'll be able to have access to the show that I was doing in 2018 and 2019, which is TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. That show is now a 30-minute show, TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. And you'll be able to access those at the TBR Radio button there at barnesreview.org. So you'll be able to keep up with both radio shows, and I know that you'll want to do that. One thing that I found interesting about our discussion with Paul Angel today, I'm going to repeat that for you. That is Paul at barnesreview.org, or maybe it was Paul at barnesreview.com. Try both. One of them will work. But he gave out his email address, and it's paul at barnesreview.com or .org. And take advantage of that. Email Paul. He does want to hear from you. And, of course, our magazine gets better and better and better when you, our listeners and our subscribers, contribute and give us input. And so I found that just to be a tremendous, because there are a lot of magazine editors that do not want to be bothered by hearing from their readers. But that's not the case here at the Barnes Review, at TBR. Our editor staffs love to hear from you. In fact, I'm one of the contributing editors at TBR Magazine. If you want to reach out to me personally, director at dixieheritage.net. Director at dixieheritage.net. That's my direct personal email address. And I'll get your emails if you want to talk about anything that you're hearing on one of my radio shows. If you want to talk about something you're reading in my Dixie Heritage newsletter. If you're just wanting to say, hey, here's something I'd like to see in the Barnes Review magazine, or hey, this is something I saw in the Barnes Review magazine, I'd love to hear from you as well. Paul would love to hear from you. I know that you can send postal letters and so forth to our editor, John Tiffany, to our other contributing editors. I know John Friend and Clint Lacey and Pat Shannon, and I know any of a number of our other contributing editors, Dave Gahary. I know these guys would love to hear from you. And you could comment on their articles as well. So be sure to do that. I also want to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, so you can get a free subscription to my weekly email newsletter. And when you do, I will send you absolutely free of charge a copy of my very politically incorrect history book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So hopefully you'll take advantage of that resource as well. We live in very perilous times. We live in very uncertain times. We live in a day and an age where we may actually be witnessing the collapse of our country and the collapse of even Western civilization as we've known it. And that's scary. The collapse of the country is no big deal. Greece fell. Western civilization continued. Rome fell. Western civilization continued. The Third Reich fell. Western civilization continued. The Soviet Union collapsed. Western civilization continued. Royal families have come and gone in the nations of Europe. Western civilization has continued. Nations have come and gone and maybe even come back. Like, for example, Poland came, Poland went. Poland became German, then Poland became Soviet, and then Poland became Poland again. But Western civilization continued. America could come and go and Western civilization could continue. But unfortunately, we may be watching the destruction of both our country and Western civilization simultaneously. And so that is why publications like the Barnes Review and radio programs like this one are so important. Because not only are we fighting that societal decay and collapse, but we're making sure that the record will stay straight. Because there are a lot of people who, for future generations, are going to want to try to bastardize and pervert the historical record so that when future generations look back, they will either know who saved or who killed our Western civilization. Anyways, we are out of time, so I am going to end the broadcast. I will say we will be back again next week, same time, same place. I'll be there, you be there too. Until then,